Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackman. I am your host, David Blackman, and my special guest today is Kathleen Sgamma, the president of the Western Energy Alliance, a regional trade association based in Denver that represents mainly independent producers, but I think also represents some of the big independents as well. Kathleen, how are you?
Great. How are you, Dave?
I'm great. I'm great. It's been too long since we talked. I kind of embarrassed about that, frankly.
No, I know. And, you came and spoke to us, David, and, it's been a while and it's great to reconnect.
Really is. You do such great work at the Alliance. I wanted to give you a chance before we go into Q&A to talk about the association. Give us a little background on its history, its membership, and your mission.
Great. Well, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we represent independent oil and gas producers all across the Rocky Mountain West. Our primary states out in the West when it comes to oil and natural gas, of course, are North Dakota, Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Montana, and Nevada. So we are a regional trade association. We focus on federal issues. So that involves a lot of public lands and tribal, air quality, water quality. Obviously, methane is the thing that everybody has to be especially concerned about. Things that cross over state boundaries. We work really closely with the state trade associations, but we don't do state-specific issues. So
Yeah.
Dumpster fire that is Colorado is not something I actually directly.
Well, you are blessed with that. That's for sure.
I know it's kind of funny because I've been doing this for about 18 years now, and we really do a lot on public lands issues. And it's really pathetic that public lands look better than operating in Colorado on private lands. It's a pretty sad state of affairs, actually.
It really is. And it is sad because, even as recently as a dozen years ago, even as recently as Governor Hickenlooper, Colorado was a great place to do business. And now it's just, but anyway, we're not going to talk about that. So you also have a very active presence in Washington, D.C., don't you?
That's right. Since we do focus on those federal issues, what our role is within the ecosystem of oil and gas trade associations is to bring the voice of the Western producer to Washington, D.C. We also, ally with states and governors and AGs all across the West as well. But we bring that outside the Beltway experience to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, you do a lot of testifying before Congress, don't you, personally?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
So we've had this recent trend here over the last couple of months where witnesses who are scheduled to testify at some of these hearings simply don't show up. What's going on there, and how do they get away with that?
Well, I think they just don't. It's kind of like the disdain that the 3 university presidents gave to Elise Stefanik during the hearing. They act as if they don't have to be accountable to Congress if it's Republicans they're talking to. They only have to talk to their echo chamber on the left. And so they don't even feel the need to engage with those with different opinions. So you saw with those university presidents, they absolutely were looking at her with disdain as if she was a complete idiot,
right,
not getting their wokeness. And it backfired big time on them. I'm only disappointed because my university president is the only one who survived that. And despite my needling on social media and the like, and the fact that I've withdrawn any support to my alma mater, is absolutely no. I mean, I just don't have the pull of Dave Ackerman. So
So I'm trying to remember. Is that MIT?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Sally Cornbluff remains in her position. And, we see the dumpster fire that's on campuses all across the country regarding, these pro-Hamas demonstrations. And, the university presidents can't even figure out how to get over their DEI. It's just terrible. Anyway, so back to sorry to go down that tangent, but I think that's what you see is like this this disdain for anybody with a different opinion. And I think they do it at their peril. So I was at this hearing recently, and the subject was natural capital accounting, which is a fairly wonky thing that comes out of the Tubin Center at Yale. Specifically, there's one economics professor who's been really pushing that in the United States. It's also being pushed by the UN, which, tells you want to know. But this one professor is really pushing this, and he's gotten the whole of government approach Biden administration, had 27 different agencies, all figuring out how they can work natural capital accounting into everything they do, just like they're working DEI in or climate change. Everything is always climate change, right? And so he wouldn't even show up for this hearing. And as a result, he didn't defend his academic ideas. Like, how pathetic is academia that they're afraid to appear before Congress in a hearing on a policy issue? This was not a gotcha hearing.
Well, it is a shame, and it makes it a lot more difficult to do intelligent formulation of policy when part of the argument won't talk to you. And of course, it works the other way too, right? I mean, we've always, as an industry, been able to talk with policymakers at the Department of Interior, the EPA, whatever federal agency, and most state agencies too, to at least get in and tell your side of the story. And unfortunately, I think in this administration, that's gotten an awful lot harder to do, hasn't it?
I think and I do a lot of work with the Interior Department, and I think they realize that they can't just shut us out, right?
Right.
Sit and meet with us. But I don't always know how effective it's going to be, because it's really run by the environmental left.
Right.
And that's fine. That's what happens with Democrat administrations. However, sometimes you're just like, well, I can sit there and talk to them, but I know that they're going to do a conservation or preservation only agenda, despite what their laws say. So we look at, for example, the Bureau of Land Management's conservation rule. This is a rule that it should publish in the Federal Register at any point. It upends the balance on federal lands so that it elevates conservation above productive uses of federal lands like mining, ranching. And, this is on lands that are appropriate. They're working landscapes. We're not talking about national parks and wilderness areas and the like, but they're trying to make all public lands, even those working landscapes, basically off limits to productive uses of those lands.
Yeah, and they've kind of got to rush that up now, right? Because they're running out of time.
Right.
I guess they need to get it finalized. They'll have to have it finalized by July 1st, right? Or it will be subject to recall by the next Congress.
It is even earlier than July 1st. I'm thinking that date for the Congressional Review Act is more like the beginning of June, end of May.
Okay. Yeah, anyway, it's hard to keep up with. And we saw that when President Trump came in 2017, there were quite a number of regulations that had been done in the last 6 months of the Obama administration that ended up being taken off the books through the Congressional Review Act. Do you think, let's say Trump wins, and you end up with a Republican majority, which would have to, obviously be very narrow in both houses of Congress, do you anticipate there'd be a similar kind of activity going on early next year?
Absolutely. However, Trump was the first president that really used the CRA.
Yeah.
It was the first time. It had only been used once, and I think it was something like 16 times, it was used way more than it had ever been used. And so this administration is extremely cognizant of that fact and is indeed trying to jam through so many things before a potential CRA deadline. So perhaps there won't be as many things that would be overturned that way, but they can't get everything in under the deadline. They just can't.
Right.
So I would think that it would be used to some extent. And the good news is it's been used already at least a couple of times, even with a Democrat majority in the Senate. We have overturned a couple of things, one of which was the Department of Labor's investment duties rule, which would have which does elevate ESG factors over material financial factors when it comes to everybody's investment plans, 401ks, pension plans. So that was overturned with bipartisan support. Of course, it was vetoed by President Biden, but it's just a good sign that even moderate Democrats are pushing back on some of the overreach of the Biden administration.
How big a loss is Joe Manchin to efforts like that in the future? He's not running for re-election. He's been a strong advocate for the oil and gas industry in his position as chairman of the Energy Resources Committee in the Senate. I mean, that's kind of a big loss, isn't it? Assuming the Democrats, end up with a 51-49 majority next time. Without Manchin, there's no telling if we're going to have any support in the Democratic Party, right?
That's true. Yes, I agree. Senator Manchin is, I think, he's a treasure for this country. He has enabled us to have more balance in our policy from both sides. It affects both. Like, yeah. I don't think you really want a country where one side rules everything in general, because, there's a balance between different opinions. And Joe Manchin is just a moderate that really represents that. But boy, does he take so much. He probably takes more flack from the left than he does from the right.
He does, yeah. Yeah, he's such a mixed bag, though. His cave in on the IRA, to me, was the end of his career. I mean, I think he was the most powerful political figure in Washington, D.C. on domestic policy before that moment in time.
Yes, he chose to give away his power, which is a little puzzling to me. I think my interpretation is he just didn't want to be the one who basically ruined the Biden administration. Yeah. I mean, he needed to show something, right? And he just wasn't willing to take, he took a lot of, grief, but that was just a bridge too far. That's a good point. And so your original question was, how much of a loss will it be? Well, I mean, at least the Republicans will have another seat, right? So is a Republican seat out of West Virginia more valuable than a Senator Manchin? Maybe not, just because having somebody who can provide some balance for both parties. I think the loss of Kyrsten Sinema is also
it's huge.
Is also bad, because she stood up against things like stacking the Supreme Court or packing the Supreme Court and getting rid of the filibuster. Do we like her, votes on everything? No, but that's not the point. The point is like working together with both sides.
Yeah, that's such a shame because she has so much courage. She displayed so much political courage during her, brief, it's going to end up being a brief time in the Senate. That is a very rare commodity in Washington, D.C. these days. She acted on her beliefs. I didn't agree with a lot of them, but you had to at least respect the way she conducted herself, where, with some of these members, and I won't name names, but it's pretty hard to respect a lot of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, you deal a lot with the Department of Interior, as you said, and we just had this new set of rules come out governing royalty rates and bonding requirements and other issues on BLM lands. Isn't that, to me, I looked at that set of new requirements, and it seemed to be really aimed at your members more than anybody else, because it's going to disproportionately impact smaller independents, I think.
It is going to price the small producer out of the market.
Yeah.
The bonding increases are 20-fold, 15 to 20-fold increases in bonding amounts. The small producer cannot access the surety market at the same rates that a large company can. So they have to put so much more collateral. And in fact, in many cases, they can't even get a bond. So they have to put up 100% of of these bonding amounts. And they add up really quickly on federal lands, to the tune of millions of dollars if you have multiple wells in the state. So the thing about it, and the reason we feel confident, we are going to announce litigation as soon as the rule is finalized. But we feel confident about that because what BLM has done is increase bonding rates 15 to 20 fold when there are 0.04% of wells on federal lands are orphans. So you have, just with that proportion alone, you have such a small percentage, yet you're going to increase bonds 20-fold. So that's way out of proportion. It's so arbitrary and capricious that we feel really confident about, successful litigation on that front.
Yeah. What about the royalty rate? 1/6, when you look at it, of course, it's been 12.5% for a long, long time, and you're going to 16.67. When you look at the standard royalty rate on a fee lease, you're talking more in the 20 to 25% range. So just taking in isolation with that comparison, people think, well, that's not unfair, right?
Right.
But again, it's something that's going to really disproportionately impact these small producers. And it feels to me almost like there's a conscious effort by this administration to crowd smaller independents completely out of the industry.
Well, I think that comes from those administrations like the current one that believe that the government is the font of all knowledge, the font of all that is good, right? So you have a very statist mentality. Everything should be from the federal government.
Right.
They like states doing their own. They want one, whatever it is, one abortion law, one, one way to control air quality, one way. There's one way for everything. One way for, managing sage grouse, even though habitat differs from state to state. It's all top down. And so when you have that mentality, then what you want is a few large companies that you can control. You want everything to be large companies that are at the trough of the federal government. So you want to make things more difficult for the free market to operate. And, all these large companies, maybe they're regulated more heavily, but, we'll also give them something. This is an administration that wants to give corporate welfare as well to wind and solar or whatever. They even included, and this is from Senator Manchin, they even included money to go to oil and gas companies to help capture methane emissions. Well, we've been doing that for decades. We don't want a handout, but you're putting so many new requirements on that you almost then there's this, well, we'll do this to you, but we'll give you money too. So they want companies feeding at the trough, and they want just few companies that they can control. So it is not surprising that a statist an administration with a statist mentality wants a few companies to control in all aspects, right? They're driving small producers, small businesses all out throughout the economy because you just can't handle all that regulation. So it's not surprising that they're trying to do that on federal lands as well. But the law is on our side, and I really do think we can prevail. I just like to emphasize with this BLM leasing rule, there are 37 orphan wells on federal lands. There are 90,250 federal producing wells. So 37 wells out of 90,000 plus is a very tiny problem, right? And most of those wells are getting plugged and reclaimed by other companies who want to operate in those areas. So the industry is already taking care of reclaiming wells. The other side will act as if, this orphan well issue, the taxpayer is being stuck with the bill. The taxpayer isn't stuck with the bill. There are so few bond calls and so few orphan wells, and most of them are going to get reclaimed by other companies. So, it's not falling on the taxpayer as it is, but yet they're going to increase bonding amounts 20-fold. So it's just way out of proportion.
Methane regulation. We've had a series of new regulations trying to regulate emissions. I wonder how, yeah, again, this is another set of regulations, I believe, that have to disproportionately impact smaller companies who don't, necessarily have a lot of staff to deal with requirements like that.
Right. The new EPA methane rules, and even by their own admissions, there are about 700,000 stripper wells or marginal wells in the United States. These are low producing wells, but the EPA rules, admittedly, that are now going after even these small producing, small emitting wells are going to put about 350,000 of those off. They're going to have to be shut in.
Wow.
The regulations are too expensive. And it sounds like, well, they're only small wells, but together, these marginal wells produce about 10% of our production. And so would we rather have that 10% coming from small companies with a well already there, right? The environmental impact has already been taken, right? So why would you want to prematurely retire those wells? It was like the Cash for Clunkers program. Remember that during the
Yes.
You're putting, it's so wasteful to take a car off the road with, because it's like all the metal, all the mining, all the environmental impact from that car. You're now going to have to buy a new car, which has more environmental impact. It's the same thing with the marginal wells. You're going to put all these wells, all these small companies out of business. And to what environmental benefit? No environmental benefit, because now you have to develop new ones.
Well, it just all seems so counterproductive to me, and it really just flies in the face of common sense. I laughed this week when I read an article. I think it was a Bloomberg piece talking about a senior official at the United Nations who was complaining about the fact that the term net zero by 2050 has now become a PR liability for the movement, right? Does that surprise you that the public is beginning to take a negative view of all of this?
Well, yeah, it's becoming particularly crystallized in the UK and Europe.
Yeah.
Because the cost, they're kind of, they bought into the whole energy transition net zero way before, California and Europe bought into it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're further along and their economies are further damaged by it. So the cost to the citizen is becoming really clear in the UK and in Europe. And as a result, their politicians are having to pull back on that net zero stuff. So yeah, it's like ESG. It all of a sudden, with just good pushback on what it really means, it's become a term that people don't even want to use anymore, right?
Right.
Then they're going to turn around and say, well, it's just a PR problem. No, it is a substantive issue. And you call it whatever the heck you want, but people get it when, you're going to make me suffer, you're going to make me pay, and it's going to affect 0.00 whatever percent of global emissions. Like if you look at the UK, they're responsible for less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, and they're going to ruin their economy and ship all their manufacturing base to China. How is that helping the environment?
Well, it's obviously not, and it also comes. I laughed again last week, or I recalled in horror, I think, at another Bloomberg piece talking about the White House again considering declaring a climate emergency, so that Biden would have all sorts of dictatorial powers over and to harm the oil and gas business. To me, it all feels like, and when I read stuff like that, it really feels like the work you're doing, and I'm doing from a different angle, we're really having an impact here, right? Do you feel the same way? I think we're really starting to have an impact.
I'm kind of surprised too, because I did not think the ESG worm would turn as soon as it did.
Yeah.
But it's just like with net zero. Reality is on our side. We can talk about, oh, we're going to get rid of oil and gas, or we're all going to get rid of all of our greenhouse gases. And then when it comes time to actually, when you see the impacts of these policies, it's just not going to fly. And then, your normal citizen is going, what? You're going to shove me into an EV? I can't charge it in the winter time. How is this going to actually work if I live in Buffalo or Chicago and I can't charge my EV during, a good portion of the year?
Right. Yeah, when you see it, the other thing that's really encouraging to me is the EV market's collapsing in the United States and Europe. And the offshore wind is collapsing. And so I just think the reality here is that people are coming to the realization, like you said, of what reality really is, which is these alternatives we're being offered aren't going to work. They're not the real solution. And so people are beginning to reject them. And I
How
think,
many times do we need to prove that government central planning doesn't work?
yeah,
Is it because it was, 40 years ago that the wall fell down and, the Soviet Union collapsed? Is that we've just forgotten how central planning didn't work? But yet the government's going to tell us what vehicles, and we're going to plan. Like, they have forced these car companies to do something that doesn't make any economic sense because people don't want these vehicles. Unless you're wealthy enough, you can afford a Tesla. It's your second vehicle for bopping around town. But when you go on a road trip, you're going to get in your, whatever, your SUV or whatever. You're not, it's a great product if that works for your lifestyle.
Exactly. And for me and my wife, it would work great for a second car, to drive around town, and if we could afford it, but we can't afford it. So
Can I just say something too? I am so sick of hearing these called zero emissions. These cars run on natural gas and coal primarily.
Well, and all the minerals mining you have to do just to build the batteries.
Right. Like there have been life cycle analyses on EVs, and it takes them several years before they become zero emission. And of course, they're really never zero emission because the electricity is not generated from dolphin smiles. So, I just hate the zero emission label applied to EVs. It's just emissions are somewhere else.
Yeah, what they always leave out is the fact that by the time you get to the point where you've achieved net zero emissions with an EV, it's time to replace the battery. And well, then you're back over here again and having to start all over.
Right.
So, well, we're running up against time. This has been great, Kathleen. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking with you. And let's not let so much time go by again before we talk again.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. And thanks to our producer, Eric Perel, and to the Sandstone Group for producing our podcast. I'm David Blackman, and that's all for now.